Hi, I'm a Christ follower declaring victory from alcohol, and I struggle with contentment. My name is Paul. Hi, Paul. I was raised in a Christian home as a Christian, and I was never taught there was anything other than Christians. I didn't know there was such people as non-Christians in this world. It was expected in my house that I'd be raised a Christian, and I'd be baptized as an infant. I'd do profession of faith, and would attend church and Sunday school. By the way, my mom did all my homework for my profession of faith. I attended the class with my older brother and really had no idea or no clue what I was doing there or why I was there. I defined my Christianity as being on a highway with some detours from that highway. However, I rarely talk about those detours. I'm not the only one that was brought up in a strict Christian home with lots of rituals that defined what made our faith. And I walked away from the church and the church rituals. No one fought going to church on Sundays, but at age 18, my brothers just moved out and stopped going to church. I first objected to going to church when my friends wanted to go water skiing. Mom held firm that I was going to go to church first. We fought about it all the way to church, and she finally gave in and let me out a block from church, about 10 miles from home. By the time I got home, my friends had left. I guess you could say I missed the boat. That was kind of my first detour from the corporate faith I was raised in. I started drinking somewhere around the age of 16. Friday mornings in high school, we had a breakfast club, which involved drinking before school. Weekends were filled with parties among my group of friends, and I chose my college, the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, because at the time the drinking age in Wisconsin was still 18. College was not an event I took seriously. My first semester GPA clearly reflected my only selection criteria, and I wore my 1.67 GPA with pride. I decided I better start taking school seriously and boost my GPA. So at the age of 19, I enrolled in the Army ROTC because all my friends told me that was an easy A and it would boost my GPA. I was now in love with my new community of drinking buddies, and I had a new plan, which was to get my commission in the Army. I contracted to join the Army on June 14th, 1982 at the age of 20. My plan was working well until January 2, less than 6 months till I got commissioned, and I was out celebrating something like Monday, and I got arrested for driving under the influence. For the next 5 months, I had to justify my ability to be an Army officer. It was a rather difficult thing to do when your life revolved around your next party. I was granted a waiver and permitted to serve as an Army officer. After college, I reported to duty at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, newly commissioned second lieutenant in the Army. I made it to Fort Bragg by way of Fort Benning, Georgia. Fort Bragg is home of the 82nd Airborne, and it's well known for working hard and playing harder. The culture in the 80s in the Army, well, actually all the services, was one of working hard and playing harder, which suited me just fine. We went to the Officers Club, or the Old Club as we referred to it, a lot. Physical training sometimes the next day was often very rough. I left the active duty for a while and entered the Army Reserve and pursued a civilian career. I eventually met my now ex-wife. We actually have 3 beautiful children. We attended church regularly and became involved in the youth program at church. I had this problem where I could not say no, and I became the vice chairman of council on program ministries, the chair of the trustees, had a seat on the ad board, and was burnt out within a year. I was so sick of the politics of the church that I isolated myself from having to do anything with the church again. We did move churches eventually, and I signed up for a men's retreat all by myself. I kind of shocked myself. For me, I got to the point where attending church was not enough. I was missing something from my life and had a black hole. I was thirsty. So I attended this men's retreat. They called it CHIRP. The acrostic would be Christ Renews His Parish. And it was designed for the Catholic Church. and that community of men filled that hole I had. As the weekend approached, though, I began dreading my decision to sign my name on the sign-up sheet. I was hoping for a presidential select call-up of the United States Army Reserve so I didn't have to go to the retreat and look like a coward for not attending. When the plastic bags were handed out for watches and, yes, pagers, I was quick to stash mine in my pocket. The weekend was filled with so much spiritual growth for me that every following Sunday I felt like attending church was a family reunion. The relationships were so strong, like those bonds of friendships I've often found here at Celebrate Recovery. The nameless faces were no longer nameless. And when the service wasn't quite what was expected, not all was wasted. There was always good fellowship. I mentioned I hoped for a presidential select call-up that year. However, the following year, I actually led that retreat. I dreaded. And for several months prior to the retreat, my participation was in question because we were actually part of a presidential select call-up of the Army Reserve. We were at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, mobilizing soldiers to go to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Those soldiers were guarding Patriot missile batteries long before 9/11. At that retreat, I presented my testimony for the first time ever, and it's changed a lot in 30 years. Also at that retreat, I made the public declaration as an adult that Jesus had died for my sins and that I chose to follow him. Life changed for a lot of people on 9/11. It had significant implications for me and my family. That night I was on the phone with my commander. I told him I knew there was going to be retribution and I wanted to be part of it. He said the Army would use me when and where the Army needed me. And right now, that's not where I was needed. I was eventually called back to active duty, and eventually where I was needed was at a very small Army post in Arlington Heights, Illinois, far from the action and where I wanted to be. I served in Arlington Heights for 2 years and was getting ready to go back to my cozy civilian life. And I got a call from a guy in Atlanta, and he told me, your country is fighting 2 wars, and we need you in Atlanta, Fort McPherson. I packed up my family and moved. The reality was, I dragged my family, all of them kicking and screaming, all the way to Atlanta, Georgia. When I got to Atlanta, there was a nice little gig on a quaint historic Army post, Fort McPherson, which is now part of the Tyler Perry movie studio. You can see parts of the old fort while watching The Walking Dead and the movie Halloween, among other shows. As our family's biggest challenge was finding a church, after a few months, we set our only selection criteria for finding a church. The screening criteria was if someone approached us or talked to us. That was the week before I was to deploy, and we finally settled on a church where one lady came and asked us if we were new to the area. We lived in a typical southern community with big front porches and lots of typical southern gossips. I became known for driving around in my golf cart with my red cup filled with my usual beverage of choice, which was alcohol and Diet Coke. When I started at Fort McPherson, I began my fight to get back into the fight and deploy to Afghanistan or Iraq. And I was politely told each time, thanks for offering, Paul, but you are needed here. I was persistent and eventually deployed to Kuwait. Closer to the action, but not where I wanted to be. I returned from Kuwait and I was greeted at the Atlanta airport by my family. They were just so thoughtful. They brought my signature red cup and my beverage of choice. I was sober for over 8 months and picked up right where I left off. I never thought I had a problem. I was just a very heavy drinker and social drinker. I did quit smoking in Kuwait. I quit smoking through attending the smoking cessation classes offered at Camp Arifjan as the education. I believe the education provided the foundation I needed to finally quit. At that time, I never felt my kids were impacted by my drinking. I usually felt I was a high-functioning, heavy drinker. After all, I saw my father drink all the time, and it never had an impact on me. I picked up the sport of triathlon in 2007 and loved it, especially the bike part. I love the community surrounding the sport as well. There are a bunch of crazy people that think nothing of getting up and running 10 miles in the rain on Christmas Eve, and I don't know, that just kookiness just kind of attracted me. Triathlon and cycling have been a huge part of my life. Retirement from the Army came in 2012, and for me that was a big loss of community. Our church family had diminished because of multiple changes in the pastor. My retirement left me without that wonderful military community that I desired. My drinking stayed consistently heavy. I got a civilian job that was 5 to 10 minutes from home, which is very admirable for the Atlanta area. My wife at the time gave me a 5-day notice she was moving out. I was still a heavy drinker, but never what I considered a problem drinker. But I was in denial because I always knew that I lied to my doctor every year about how much I drank at my physical. Turns out everybody does. I kept up with my annual physicals, and I was now at the point worried that this was the year the doctor was going to tell me my liver was failing. I was prepared to quit taking my cholesterol medicine before I quit drinking. I recently heard a news article that the one person we lie to most about anything is yourself. And the 3 things we lie about the most is how much we eat, how much we drink, and how much we exercise. That was me. I couldn't tell you how much I drank because I didn't know. I think it was about 1/4 to 1/2 gallon a day. And I lied about those Hershey Kisses I ate all the time too because they're real small and they really don't count, right? The following week after my wife left me, I DNF'd or didn't finish my first race ever. It was the first time a hangover prevented me from competing. After mile 7, I fell out of the Soldier Marathon. A few months later, I lost my job and I was told they could not afford me anymore. 2 others were let go that day for the same reason. That job was the only reason I had to stay sober during the day. Now I was running from my problems by drinking all day. I now look back and think that the way I escaped my problems led me into greater captivity. Where you go when you're running will sometimes end up running you, and that's exactly what happened to me. My drinking got a lot worse, so knowing my retirement was imminent for me, I got a part-time job as a bus driver. It was really more of a control mechanism for me because I knew I would never put any children at risk, so it kept me from drinking all day. In April 2017, I didn't finish my second race. I was pulled out of the water at 800 yards in a swim of Ironman 70.3 Florida. They said I was drowning. The reality was I was so hungover I just couldn't function. Today, I tell you, as it states in step 1, I was powerless over my addiction and my life was unmanageable. Yes. From start to finish, my divorce stretched out 2 years and 8 months. And a jury decided our assets after a 4-day jury trial. There are 2 states in this country that you can get a divorce by jury trial. One's Texas and the other is Georgia. That's where we lived at the time. The last year, multiple delays because of the shenanigans played by the other side and the court availability sent me over the top. I was beginning to think my life could not get any worse. One day my son came home to me bawling in the basement over it. I tried to keep it together for him every other day, but I just couldn't this one day. This is one of many delays and another excuse for me to drink. Many times my thoughts turned dark. I'd planned to end my pain and the time was now. And as I stood, my phone rang. By the end of the call, the pain had passed for the moment, and the transition to bed where my box of wine was now awaiting me. There are no winners in divorce except lawyers. I did feel vindicated by the jury. The lawyer cost for the both of us could have raised 6 families out of poverty. I shake my head in disgust with what we could have done with that money. Beside my pain, I know the pain it caused my kids. Although 2 of them were out of the house, I could hear it in their voice every time we talked. My youngest who was 16 at the time, was often in tears. Our house sold rather quick, and lack of communication made both sets of movers arrive at the same date at the same time. This just added to the list of reasons I drank that day. The divorce was over, I had a fresh start, I was moving to Michigan. That night, after a full day of drinking, I went out for a farewell dinner with friends, which included beer, and a lot of it. My plan was to stay in the empty house, but the movers packed my air mattress, and I got a cheap room at a hotel, and I got a little lost and took an awkward turn, causing a cop to pull me over. I ran the full battery of tests with 2 cops until they decided I failed the test. I had thought differently. Thinking I had hit my low in jail with a 9 a.m. closing the next day, my small group from church took pilgrimage outside of the jail till I was released. It was my second night in jail. The first was in '87. My small group bailed me out and rushed me to the closing with just enough time to close on the house. The fact that I was able to get there for the closing was certainly, without a hitch, was certainly God's doing. After the closing, I made the painful call to my kids that I was a hypocrite and I was embarrassed by what had happened the night before. My oldest son, the Gwinnett County police officer in his last weeks of training, asked to meet before I drove to Michigan. My greatest embarrassment to date is still sitting across the table from my son with him waving his finger in my face. I sat there and took everything he had to say and did not argue one point. Despite that embarrassment, it was not enough for me to want to change. The next morning, I left for Michigan, where I could put the pain of divorce behind me and finally give up drinking and become a social drinker. Unfortunately, the movers not only packed up my air mattress, but they also packed up all my pain and my hurt and my perceived need for alcohol. The only place in Michigan I could buy my brand of booze was the military special brand was at the Coast Guard Exchange in Grand Haven, and I bought it by the case. I made weekly trips, hoping the clerk would be someone different each week. Trips became every 6 days, and then eventually, to save on gas, I started buying 2 cases a week, and I quit worrying about who the clerk was anymore. But now I was worried someone else might suspect I was a heavy drinker. And this is the sanity of this disease. I was worried that my recycling driver would think I had a drinking problem with all the liquor bottles in my bin. So I started a second recycling bin and only put out a couple bottles a week. The second bin soon filled up, and I started a third bin just for liquor bottles. I eventually turned to storing them in a shed in 55-gallon bags. I guess I thought I would become a normal drinker and be able to recycle them and look normal. I was more concerned about the recycling driver thinking about my drinking than I was my own kids. That's just nuts. In January 2019, I signed up for a small group experience at our church. They call it Rooted. It was a 9-week study. It's a small group experience to connect you with God, the church, and your purpose. Still drinking at this point, I was asking God to lead me out of this mess, which was my life. And I asked for a path for the pain and bondage I was in. The first indicator came on a Saturday night. They had a Saturday night worship. I resolved to leave my church. I was just so fed up with them. I was going to walk out and never go back to service or my small group. But before we left that night, there was a promotion for the next sermon series that was called Freed. And the image used was a person in captivity in a cage and bondage. And I saw myself in that image. I was going to give this church one more week. The next day at our Rooted group, the one I wasn't going to go back to anymore, The topic was "There is an enemy," and the memory verse was "For he has rescued us from darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his dear Son," Colossians 1:3. There we were in a small group, separate by gender, and I was probably on my 5th weekly rant about my divorce, or the pain I was in. And a friend of me, this guy in his group, looks at me and says, "Dude, you got issues. You need to come to Celebrate Recovery." My reply to him was, "I'm not one of those people. I don't have a drug or alcohol problem." So he goes on to explain to me that 1 out of 3 people there were there for drugs and alcohol, and the rest were there for her having her hang-up. And he said, "I certainly fell in that category." So, each week we hear at our Celebrate Recovery that they offer you new hope, new life in Christ, and new friendships. And they weren't kidding. With that simple invitation for a friend, for the first time in years, through all my pain and all my hurt and all my anguish, I had begun to see a glimmer of new hope, which was a path of darkness for me. One of my notes from that week's rooted lesson was, "Lord, help me find your will be done, not my will. I am not in control." What my buddy didn't know, or actually no one knew, was that the following weekend, I was required to attend impact training near Marion. I've lived here 5 years, and I still don't remember where it was. To get my Georgia driving privileges reinstated from my DUI that I received the previous year. Impact Weekend says it's a program proven effective for all substance abuse offenders. It was 36 hours of education of addiction by fire hose. And that education, like the smoking cessation, became the cornerstone of my recovery. So here's how messed up my thinking was. I knew that I could never jeopardize any of my cycling friends by riding a little 15-pound bike with a hint of alcohol, but never thought twice about getting behind the wheel of my truck. Pretty nuts. Back to Impact Weekend. That weekend, God had done for me what I couldn't do for myself, and I completed steps 1, 2, and 3 before I knew what step 1, 2, and 3 even was. I just didn't know what was next. We admitted we were powerless over our addictions and compulsive behavior, that our lives had become unmanageable. I know that nothing good lives in me, and that is my sinful nature. And we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That Monday following Impact Weekend, I attended my first CR and was welcomed to my new community of believers. I've attended almost every week, even during COVID, online. I've completed several step studies, and I've helped lead a couple step studies, and if you've never done one, I would encourage you to. Being baptized as an infant, I never felt the need to be baptized as an adult. Less than a month in recovery, I decided to make that commitment public as an adult, and I would do so at the very next chance I could. It was Easter weekend, 2019. An opportunity to cleanse away my past and make me new. Amen. More importantly, my baptized signified to me that I just wouldn't believe in Jesus, I would follow him. And I took no shame to make him known. It wasn't the healing I had hoped for. Faced with nightmares from the divorce, and at the encouragement of my doctors and several friends, I decided to give counseling a try. And the VA diagnosed me with PTSD from my divorce. I used to think that was reserved for the true warriors that were kicking in doors and fighting the enemy, but that's not the case. 2019, I went for my physical for the first time, and I wasn't worried about my liver enzymes. However, my doctor was worried about my heart murmur. It was only the 3rd doctor to ever detect it. I was born with it. Something was different this time. He sent me for an echo and a TEE, stress test, the whole 9 yards, and it showed that my lower left ventricle was underperforming. However, my overall function of the rest of my heart was in great shape. 3 years sobriety, and my heart function was at the time normal. In my chart, it's documented as alcoholic cardiac myopathy. I never thought that alcohol would deteriorate my heart. I just thought it was focused on my liver. Recently, last year, I started with another heart issue called AFib. It's where the upper and lower chambers are not beaten in sync. And you know, one of the favorite ways to help prevent that was sleep. So I kind of like that. But this week past week I moved into a new phase, and I've got this great cardiologist, I'm sure you all know him, Dr. Google. And I've progressed into the next stage, so I'm going to have to go back to my cardiologist and get something else and get the official results. So I moved to Michigan to help my aging mother, who died in 2021, and I vowed never to stick around because of the cold and snow. However, I'm sticking around because who I met. Around the time I was baptized, I met my wife. She joined our small group at church, and like most people in a new relationship, I checked out her Facebook profile. And I'm not much for love at first sight, but seeing her profile picture of her in front of her bike, I knew it was meant to be. We dated for over 2 years because we both needed time to heal from divorces, and I didn't want to rush into anything. And in September 2021, I made the leap and asked her to marry me on the beaches at Lake Michigan, Camp Geneva. We were married during a snowstorm the following January. Pain changes a lot of people. For me, I had to live through insanity to find serenity. I remind myself, though, that I'm not defined by my past. It only informs me. Time can sometimes be my worst enemy, because I sometimes have too much of it on my hands. So I spend my day going to the gym and doing 12-step work. I spend time with my wife and my stepson. And recently I enrolled in online classes studying C.S. Lewis. And I struggle a lot with contentment. Recently I had an amazing opportunity to work with some missionaries in the mountains in Oaxaca, Mexico. The native Mexican village is very similar to the Native Americans and their tribes with regard to U.S. laws, but in Mexico. As we drove into the small town of about 1,000 people, they were predominantly Catholic. There was this one man who was the town spokesman, and he was broadcasting over his PA, making announcements. But with everyone we visited, they always pulled out these stackable chairs that they all have, and he was one of about 15 Christians in this town, and the rest were non-believers or they were Catholics. When he became a Christian, he was shunned by the entire town. They eventually made him the spokesman again because he did such a good job. The belief was that if his family got sick from COVID, it was because he was a Christian. If another family got sick because of COVID, well, that was just a coincidence. The family lived with nothing, no plumbing, an outhouse, dirt floors. By U.S. standards, the house would be condemned. That's just like all the homes we visited while we were there. I found that these people had they had several things in common. Number one was a firm belief in Jesus. Two, that they were always such gracious hosts. We had 6 people for lunch, and the family only owned 3 plates, so the guests got the plates. And number 3, they were just extremely content with what they had. They had everything they needed, which God had given them, and that was all they were needed. I had to travel thousands of miles to learn what it takes to be content. They're dirt poor, but poverty isn't having too little; it's wanting more. So the path to recovery is not the same for everyone. The starting point is different, but the key ingredient is faith. Jesus reminds us in Mark 5:34 that your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. The path of least resistance is rarely the path to obedience. So this past 5 years, I've been trying to rebrand myself since I separated from the service. And I realized that after representing the Army brand most of my life, I was in denial and realized 30 years that God is wanting me to leverage that. So at my home church at Celebrate Recovery at Central Wesleyan, I helped launch the new leg of Welcome Home initiative. And that's the Celebrate Recovery version of the veteran group. So I'm also working on starting an AA meeting at the VFW. It's going to be open to all veteran service organizations. And I'm also enrolled in Warrior at Ease, so I can help veterans who are transitioning and with trauma through yoga and meditation. So the Welcome Home Initiative is to reach out and welcome veterans in the military back into the Sierra family. My name is Paul, and I am a child of God. Thank you very much for listening.